Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is a over 100-year-old faith-based justice-seeking organization that energizes people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we are so excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with United Methodists for Kairos Response. Just a few announcements for our call today. Please continue to, you can choose to have your video on or off if you like. Everyone is muted at this time when our speakers will be presenting. Our webinars are a place to learn, engage, and be in community together. And in order to create an equitable and brave space, we do not tolerate any sort of hate speech or disrespect on our calls. And we know that we will all be treating each other with great respect and care as we engage in these very important conversations. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days, and you'll have access to that. As you have questions, we invite you to use the chat box and feel free to ask your questions during the conversation. They'll be either sent directly to the host or sometimes they'll be shared where other folks can see it. But if you type it in there, we will receive your questions for the Q&A time. And we are offering closed captioning. It is automatically generated. And so expect to see some spelling errors or other errors. That often happens with the closed captioning. We are so excited about our conversation today, and I'm going to turn our conversation over to our moderator, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. My name is Paula Roderick. I'm a member of the steering committee of United Methodists for Kairos Response, so the abbreviation UMKR. And UMKR is a movement for Palestinian human rights, and our goal is freedom, justice, and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. To achieve that goal, we engage in boycott and divestment campaigns, political actions to change government policy, and education to help our church and our society understand what's really happening in the Holy Land and how we can support the Palestinian people in their liberation struggle. As Christians, we believe that God has called us to this justice-seeking, peacemaking work. We invite you to check out our website, www.kairosresponse.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Kairos Response to stay engaged with our work. Before we begin with our speakers, we wanted to set the stage with a very short video. It's called When I See Them, I See Us. The Black-Palestinian Solidarity campaign released this video in October 2015. The organizations that came together to make it included the Dream Defenders, and you'll recognize one of our speakers, Ahmed, is in this video, and also the co-founder of Dream Defenders, BYP 100, the DC Palestinian Film and Arts Festival, IMEU, Jewish Voice for Peace, and the Arab Studies Institute. You're going to recognize many of the activists, Black and Palestinian, that are in this video. About this project, the organizers wrote, quote, "We choose to join one another in resistance, not because our struggles are the same, but because we each struggle against the formidable forces of structural racism. This video intends to interrupt that process, to assert our humanity, and to stand together in an affirmation of life and a commitment to resistance." Here's the video.
When I see them, I see us.
Every 28 hours, a Black life is stolen by police or vigilantes in the U.S.
Every 2 hours, a Palestinian child was killed in Israel's attack on Gaza last summer.
Eric Garner, 43 years old, father of 6, grandfather, friend.
Ghalia El-Ghannam, 7 years old, killed when an Israeli missile struck her home.
Hashem Abu Maria, 45 years old, father of 4, human rights worker.
Ayana Jones, 7 years old, killed in her sleep by Detroit police.
When I see them, I see us.
Harassed, beaten, tortured, dehumanized.
Stopped and frisked, searched at checkpoints.
Administrative detention, youth incarceration. When I see them,
I see us.
From Rikers Island to Ofer Prison.
From Rafah to Chicago.
Lives are being stolen.
Remember them.
We are not statistics. We are not collateral damage. We have names and faces.
Sakia,
Nadim,
Kimani,
Jawahir,
Renisha.
Muhammad.
they burned me alive in Jerusalem.
They gunned me down in Chicago.
they shot our water tanks in Hebron.
They cut off our water in Detroit.
They demolished our homes in the Nakab.
They swallowed our homes in New Orleans.
When I see them, I see us.
They see our wombs as dangerous, label us demographic threats. They sterilize us without our knowledge.
Mark our children as criminal.
We say no to all forms of oppression in U.S. cities or on Palestine's streets.
We respect the uniqueness of our struggles and our varied histories.
When I see them, I see us. Resilient, steadfast, determined, I see who we were meant to be.
Alive, free, liberated.
Mapping out our destiny.
I see hope.
Strength.
Love,
A place where our children can dream.
I see a road,
A partner.
A family.
a world where we can rise and be seen.
Thank you, Teresa. That's a very powerful video. And I want to move into introducing Dean ADRIEN Wing. ADRIEN Wing is the Associate Dean of the College of Law at the University of Iowa, Director of the University Center for Human Rights. During her extensive history of solidarity with the Palestinian people, she served as a legal consultant for the writing of the Palestinian Basic Law, Constitution, has worked with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, has addressed the Palestinian National Council. She's a prolific author, writing on critical Black feminist theory, critical race theory, and on the intersections between human rights, feminism, Palestinian rights, and international law. As a Black feminist and an activist and an attorney, it is especially my honor to introduce Dean Wing.
Thank you so much, Paula. I am very delighted to participate in this wonderful event today. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the United Methodists for Kairos Response and the Methodist Federation for Social Action for inviting me. I'm honored to share this event with my wonderful co-panelist, Ahmed Abuznaid. He is actually representing the next generation below me in terms of their involvement in the struggle for Black and Palestinian solidarity. Now, many people ask me, how did I, an African American, get involved with the Palestinian cause? Ahmed's going to tell you about he as a Palestinian, how he got involved with African Americans. So how did I get involved? It was because of love. Not love of Palestine, because I didn't even know about Palestine. But I used to be in love with this man called Rico, whose name is Rico Melson. He's my ex-husband. But in the summer of 1982, he, as a brand new doctor, decided to volunteer to go to Beirut during the Israeli bombing of that city. And we were fresh graduates, he of med school, me of law school. We had new passports, and he volunteered. We ended up going over there, and he went to the American University Hospital and said, here I am, I'm ready to work. And they said, we don't need you here, doctor, but we're going to send you to a Palestinian hospital. We didn't even know the Palestinians had hospitals, and they had 7 in the area. So we worked in Beirut for a month. I was made a hospital administrator, and that was because most of the other administrators had left or been killed from the conflict that had started in that June. And so we were there 1 month. The day we left was the day that Bashir Gemayel, the incoming president of Lebanon, was assassinated. And so we got out to Cyprus, and then we got to London, and then we began hearing that the Israelis had come into the area above the airport where they'd been, and they had circled the area where we had been working and let in historic enemies of the Palestinians into the area, a group called the Phalangists, and that hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians and Lebanese, some of whom we had met, whom we had worked with, whom we had treated, were killed. And so that event is known as the infamous Sabra Shatila massacre of September 1982. And for a moment, I'd like us all to think about that event, because the 39th anniversary of that event just happened. And because of the fact that Rico and I survived where many people that we knew were murdered, we decided to dedicate ourselves, and we were already involved with the Black Power movement, and I was also involved with the South African anti-apartheid movement. We decided we would also dedicate our lives and our political work to the Palestinian movement. And so now for nearly 40 years, I have been involved in that movement, and so that is why I am in front of you today. And as you heard, I also was involved with other issues after that time. I've probably been to Palestine 20 or more times. I was involved in helping to draft the Palestinian Basic Law. I've led countless delegations of African Americans and students to Palestine. And so that is how I got involved. Now, it turns out after that, I adopted some children, and one of my daughters is from Ethiopia, and she's Muslim, and she's hijabi. And so I have Muslim, not only a daughter, but also grandchildren, and my sister and her daughter both married Muslims as well. So we have in our family Muslims, Christians, and Jews. So I live it in my family life, and I live it in my professional life. Now, the history of Blacks and Palestinians goes way back. It's not just something brand new. And so I'm going to briefly go through a little bit of that history so we can gain strength from that knowledge. In the 1950s, Malcolm X was among the first Black activists to speak out for the Arab cause in the Arab-Israeli conflict. At that time, he was with the Nation of Islam. Later, he went to Gaza and visited refugee camps there before his assassination in 1965. After the 1960 war, more Blacks began to see Israel as a Western-sponsored entity, a colonial settler state that had dispossessed people of color. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, published a primer on the Palestine problem and talked about Zionism and its nature. The Black Panther Party expressed its support for the Palestinian resistance that emerged in the war's aftermath, portraying Fatah and the Panthers as engaged in a joint struggle against racism, Zionism, and imperialism. For groups like SNCC and the Panthers, Blacks were an internally colonized people whose position in the United States was analogous to the status of third world peoples globally. And of course, the video helps show us that. African Americans built many bridges with Black activists and politicians throughout the 60s and 70s. The Organization of Arab States invited Black power leader Stokely Carmichael to speak at their 68 convention, where he urged Black support of the Palestinian Revolution. There were Black academics who began to speak out, and of course, one of the most famous is Professor Angela Davis from UC Santa Cruz. Black groups, such as one I belonged to called the National Conference of Black Lawyers, spoke out, sent delegations, etc. During the apartheid era, Blacks spoke out on the Israel-South Africa connection. What I found out when I began to speak out on the issue, that if Blacks had never focused on the Palestinian struggle before, when I mentioned the similarities to South African apartheid, they could all relate. In recent years, organizers have been trying to rebuild this momentum, and you've had many Black activists visit the West Bank to see how the Palestinians are living now. Of course, you've seen this video, you've heard of the activity of the Dream Defenders, and Ahmed in his remarks will address the Dream Defenders, he being critical to that group's founding. In 2015, more than 1,000 Black organizers and intellectuals signed a solidarity statement condemning Israel's lopsided war on Gaza and stranglehold on the West. In 2016, the Movement for Black Lives Matter, did a political platform that called Israel an apartheid state. After protests related to Ferguson and the death of Michael Brown, Palestinians gave advice to Blacks on how to deal with tear gas. One Palestinian said, the solidarity between the African-American community and Palestinians acts as a united front against the selectivity and exclusivity of human rights. Angela Davis subsequently wrote a book I recommend to you if you haven't read it yet, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. In 2017, 11 members of the Congressional Black Caucus co-sponsored Representative Betty McCollum's bill to prohibit US aid to Israel from being used to detain Palestinian children, and that bill has continued to be brought up. Among other Blacks who have even more recently spoke out include Professor Michelle Alexander, well known for the new Jim Crow, and she wrote a powerful op-ed in the New York Times. I recommend to you to Google that if you haven't read that. Reverend Dr. William Barber II has demonstrated unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people. And in 2019, he said, we cannot talk about justice without addressing the displacement of Native peoples, the systematic racism of colonialism, and the injustice of government repression. I want to say as clearly as I know how that the humanity and the dignity of any person or peoples must not be diminished. To hold fast to the image of God in every person is to insist that the Palestinian child is as precious as a Jewish child. But I hope you are aware, and if you're not, there are many Black people, including myself, who have paid a price for speaking out on Palestine. And it is this threat that causes many others not to speak up. So when you question, well, why hasn't this leader or that leader or this group of people said something, it's because of that power, that incredible force that is organized to shut down any opposition to what the state of Israel does. Some of you may be old enough to remember in 1979 when UN ambassador and former civil rights leader Andrew Young had to resign after he secretly met with a representative of the PLO. And that was all the way back in '79. And one of Young's defenders was Reverend Jesse Jackson, who led a delegation to the Middle East immediately after the Young affair. And he met with both Israelis and PLO officials. And he pushed for the US to directly negotiate with the PLO way back when they were just being called terrorists by the US government. We have had some of our Black athletes who have supported the Palestinians and have tweeted, like Dwight Howard. He tweeted "Free Palestine" and got so much blowback that he had to retract. Also, in 2018, CNN fired Temple University professor Mark Lamont Hill, a longtime contributor, after he made negative remarks about Israel doing a UN speech. And he had drawn scrutiny for calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea. He wrote a book I highly recommend, along with Mitchell Plitnick, that's called "Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics." Even the most distinguished Blacks have paid a price. So this year, Harvard professor Cornel West was denied tenure, and he said, "To witness a faculty enthusiastically support a candidate for tenure, then timidly defer to a rejection based on the Harvard administration's hostility to the Palestinian cause was disgusting. This kind of narcissistic academic professionalism, cowardly deference to the anti-Palestinian prejudices of the Harvard administration, and indifference to my mother's death constitute an intellectual and spiritual bankruptcy of deep depths. So this current support from Black groups must be seen in light of this history. So you all know and have heard of what's happening now, how so many proponents from different groups, including Black Lives Matters, have stood up, have had protests this spring, including more athletes. We've had some politicians, such as New York State Assembly member Zarin Mamdani, chant, "When I say BDS, you say BLM." And of course, we have some progressive members of Congress who have spoken out and will continue to, including Cori Bush, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Palestinian member Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Jamal Bowman, and others. And so this is all very, very good, but it's not enough. So what do we do? What do we do as we continue to see images of Israeli military who put their feet on the necks of Palestinians who say, "I can't breathe"? And Black people say, "Oh, that sounds like George Floyd. We know about that." Where do we go from here? Dr. King wrote in 1967 a book called "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" While the momentum may continue to build between Black and Palestinian communities, it also seems to ebb and flow. It seems we can often lean toward chaos in the COVID post-Trump new abnormal world. Will this time be any different as a new generation continues to be exposed to what many of us here have known our whole lives? I have 17 grandchildren so far. Will their grandchildren still be dealing with the same realizations? Solutions must include continued and enhanced coalition building between Palestinians, Blacks, other concerned groups such as today's co-sponsors, along with progressive legislators, corporations, and the entire international community. While the reality can be depressing, I remain inspired by the words of the late former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who had a strong relationship with the Palestinian people. And Nelson Mandela said, "The struggle is my life." And he said that when he was in prison and had no idea he'd ever get out, much less be the first Black president. It may be that my grandchildren's grandchildren will still be dealing with such issues, including racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, etc. We will each here be judged, not by whether we are successful in ending all of these isms in our lifetime, but the nature of the quality of the struggle that we will be committed to engaging in every day for the rest of our lives, whether those lives end tomorrow or 60 or 80 years from now. I will close with a well-known paraphrase of Dr. King's frequent quote from the Bible, Amos 5:24. "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Thank you very much. Shukran.
Shukran, and thank you, Dean Wing. You have given us so much. You've put so much on our plate to understand the history and the background. So it is my honor to introduce the next speaker, who's going to pick up a little from where Dr. Dean Wing left us. I first met Ahmed Abuznayed in May 2015 when he was heading up the Dream Defenders here in Chicago and joined a panel. He joined a panel hosted by Arab-Jewish Partnership for Peace and Justice in the Middle East, supporting and defending civil rights. It's good to see him here. After completing law school, Ahmed went on to co-found the Dream Defenders, which is a leading group in the movement for Black lives in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012. While in leadership at Dream Defenders, Ahmed championed racial justice issues across the US and successfully led several delegations to Palestine. Those included prominent Black African leaders, such as the co-founder of Black Lives Matters, one of the co-founders, Patrisse Cullors, a leader in the BYP 100, Charlene Carruthers, the scholar and national commentator, Mark Lamont Hill. Today, Ahmed is the executive director of USCPR, that's the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. It's a premier national organization in the Palestinian rights movement. It feels so fitting to have him here on the 20th anniversary of that organization. And Ahmed, with no further ado, please come in and tell us how you got involved in the Black struggle and how that informed what you do for Palestine.
All right, thank you, Paula, Teresa, the whole UMKR organizing crew for bringing us all together today. And of course, thank you to Dean Adrian Wing for that presentation. I so much enjoyed the preparation for this panel that, I think it's just a really special place to be in when you can share in the historical nature of a solidarity fight, a historical nature of a fight for justice, and also couch it within this current moment. And so I think we're in a special moment as it relates to Palestine in the US. And really, there's no way we get to this moment without the decades of work that Dean Wing was just lifting up for us, without the decades of blood, sweat, tears, backlash, fallouts, and more that we have seen leading to this point. And I think before I get into some of but yet we remain vigilant, we remain committed. And I think that that's something that we should be proud of. The fact that we've taken, several bumps and bruises and in fact lost many of our people fatally. But, we know that, as Dr. King told us, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And we know that we have a goal in mind that those of us here in the United States, if we give it our all, if we truly look at being collaborators and co-conspirators with like-minded individuals and organizations, we see a goal that we can see to fruition. So with that being said, I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to this point. I was born in East Jerusalem, occupied Palestine. And at the age of 1, my parents made the decision to bring us to the US. And I think similar to the stories of many immigrant families, my parents looked at the possibilities of raising a child under occupation. And since my father had the privilege of having a US citizenship at the moment, he took it upon him to move our family to the US. I lived a couple of years in Virginia, and then I really began to grow up in Florida. But at the age of 7, my parents decided, that it was then time for me to return to Palestine for a bit of my childhood, to, become closer to our culture, to understand our history, to understand the dynamics on the ground, to meet my family. For so many reasons, it made sense for us to live a few years in Palestine together. And so I did that from age 7 to 12. And some of the experiences that stick out are experiences that many of you who've traveled to Palestine have felt yourself. The checkpoints, the invasive security measures taken upon by the Israelis onto any folks who are visiting the land. And so at that point in time, at age 7, I was still allowed to fly into Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. I flew in with my mother, and we were promptly strip searched by the Israeli security forces in the airport. And so even at age 7, you begin to become aware of something really being wrong here. And of course, for me as a 7-year-old, I had kind of experienced what we call in the US, quote unquote, freedom. And I have to note that, as a Palestinian, as someone who is Arab and more fair-skinned, who was growing up middle class in the US, I had an experience of freedom that maybe isn't representative of everyone's experience with quote unquote freedom in the US. But going from that reality to one in the West Bank, where I could have guns pointed at me at any point in time, checkpoints limiting my movement, strip searches, and then that brings me to one of the, I think, more sobering experiences I had as a child. There was when I was I was 10 years old, and in 1994, I was living in Hebron, also known as Al Khalil, and then a settler from Brooklyn, New York, opened fire in the Ibrahimi Mosque during the morning prayers during the holy month of Ramadan, murdering 30 Palestinians, injuring over 100, before he was neutralized by the Palestinians who were in prayer that day. What sticks out to me about that moment is that, you know, as a 10-year-old, we really do, when we're children, kind of have this altruistic view of humanity and of the world. And so I remember at 10 years old remarking to my parents that maybe because of what just happened in the mosque, maybe because of the tragedy that we just saw, the Israeli authorities, the Israeli military would respond and help us in this moment. You know, we had just gotten massacred. But again, I mentioned it was a sobering moment for me. What happened was the Israelis, because of the incident, they enforced a curfew on the Palestinians, something called Man'at Tajawul, which meant that we effectively could not even leave our homes. And so as a 10-year-old kid, that meant no playing outside with my friends, no going for a walk to the store, but also no school for 2 weeks' time. And the Israelis would do this from time to time to make sure the streets were clear, there was no resistance, no stone throwing, but also so that they could be able to round up any Palestinians they want, because they could simply go to their homes and then round us up and take us to prison. So that moment really spoke a lot to the animosity, the violence, the depravity of the occupation and how it would operate with regard to Palestinians. So at age 12, after I had a couple more experiences of Israeli oppression, age 12, we moved back to the US because I was nearing, the start of high school. My parents thought it important for me to be able to get an education in US high school so that I could go to college. So we came back to the US and I started to notice things about the US. It wasn't really the perfect utopia that I imagined it at age 7. Now that I was a little bit older, now that I had experienced oppression myself, I started to notice things in class, in school. I started to notice the way that some of my Black classmates were treated versus how some of my white classmates were treated. And I mean, in the sense that we all had class clowns, but I would notice a distinction at times in between the way that certain classmates would be allowed to misbehave without certain penalties versus others that were immediately, sent to the principal's office or given detention or so on and so forth. This stuff stuck with me as I continued to, learn about criminalization. And as a pre-law magnet student, of course, I had a deeper interest in, the criminal justice system and the different angles of approaching that system. And so these things resonated with me. And then I think one of the more impactful moments of my life, if we fast forward a few years until I was in college, I was at Florida State University. I was student body vice president at FSU. And there was a young boy named Martin Lee Anderson that was pronounced dead in a nearby juvenile boot camp. This happened in Bay County, Florida, which is Northwest Florida, about maybe 2 hours away from Florida State University. So we were kind of, monitoring the situation, and then actually some new information was exposed about the case. We found out that there was a cover-up by the medical examiner and the sheriff's office looking to proclaim the death to be a result of complications from sickle cell anemia. And then, of course, a video was uncovered and publicized showing boot camp guards beating on young Martin Lee until he collapsed and was no longer breathing. So as a Palestinian, having grown up under occupation, many folks imagine that my first protest in my life, my first time taking direct action, my first time, responding to these systems of injustice, most people assume it was a Palestine-related incident. But for me, it was actually, this killing, this murder of Martin Lee Anderson. It spoke to me as a Palestinian. I had so many times heard stories back in Palestine of folks from our community being gunned down or being killed with no measure of justice, no measure of accountability. And so here I was 21 years old, at Florida State University. And this young Black boy, 14 years old, was killed, and we saw it literally on camera. And myself and my colleagues knew that it was a time for action. So along with 30 other individuals from FSU, FAMU, and Tallahassee Community College, we came together and we launched a sit-in. At that point in time, Governor of Florida was Jeb Bush. And at the time we launched the sit-in, Governor Jeb Bush was in Iraq because of the US war in Iraq, and he had went to go speak to the troops. So we aggressively demanded that the governor return home immediately to handle his business as governor of the state of Florida. And we had several other demands laid out, such as, for instance, the closing of all juvenile boot camps in the state of Florida, such as the arrest and charging of all of the individuals that were seen on camera beating young Martin Lee. And just like many of the campaigns you all have been involved in, we were able to get some of those demands met and others not so much. So we did get all of the juvenile boot camps closed. We were very proud of that. We did see the arrest of the individuals that were beating on Martin Lee Anderson. We did not see any charges of murder nor any sentencing or convictions in that regard, but we saw some of those demands met. And last thing before I move on from the demands is that, you know, a lot of times as organizers, we gotta be able to envision not only where to take our struggles and our organizations, but also how the system will reinvent itself, how the system will revise itself. And we didn't know at that time that if we called on the state to shut down juvenile boot camps, we didn't know that the state would then just start opening up residential prison facilities, privatized or otherwise, in the state. So we thought it would be the end of this sort of dynamic. What we learned was the system would reinvent itself to be able to meet its objectives. So Martin Lee Anderson was really a focal point for me in being able to take action and being empowered to know that we can actually get some results when we organize, when we demand something of those that are supposed to be serving us. I'll fast forward because after that, I went to law school until 2011. I graduated and took the bar and became in January of 2012 a member in good standing of the Florida Bar, and we're keeping that going till today, knock on wood. But in 2012, as I was wondering what I would do post law school, many of my colleagues were going on to work at the state attorney's office or to serve as a public defender in order to sharpen their skill sets. I knew that I wanted to be closer to the grassroots and closer to movement. And so in 2012, in February of 2012, young Trayvon Martin was killed. At the time, I was actually in Amsterdam visiting my father. He was in the Netherlands around that time. And I began to have conversations with some of the colleagues and comrades that I had organized with around Martin Lee Anderson. So one of the names I'll lift up is Philip Agnew. Philip and I and some other colleagues started to have conversations around, you know, what we wanted out of this moment, but also what we wanted to build. We had just fresh in our memory the experience with the Student Coalition for Justice, where we advocated for Martin Lee, and then we saw no one go to jail, and we saw boot camps transition to be residential facilities, and we saw now yet another in the long line of Black lives that we had lost to state violence and, of course, vigilante violence, here with this example of Trayvon Martin. So we talked about if we were to come back together to build something in this moment, we wanted it to be something lasting. We wanted it to be something that wouldn't just advocate for Trayvon, but would really tackle the systemic nature of the violence communities have been facing. And so we launched the Dream Defenders, and we marched. Our first action was a march from Bethune-Cookman, which is a historically Black college and university in Daytona. We marched to Sanford, Florida, where Trayvon was killed. And on that march, we talked a lot about Palestine. We talked a lot about state-sanctioned violence. We talked a lot about vigilante violence and how they would be inspired by these different, you know, policies of racism and discrimination. And I was wearing a keffiyeh, and, you know, for the folks that weren't as knowledgeable about Palestine, it served as a really great organizing tool to be able to open up on the subject with them. And that really led to a couple of years later, Dream Defenders beginning to take these delegations, to Palestine. We thought that Dream Defenders had a role as an internationalist Black-led organization. It had a role in educating people, not just about Palestine, but about Brazil, but about Mexico, and about, of course, the historical nature of these relationships in solidarity. And so thankful that in 2014, the moments of Ferguson and Gaza allowed for those of us from the Black and Palestinian communities to find each other again. Those of us from the younger generation who hadn't been a part of this historic solidarity to engage in this solidarity. And so, you know, those tough moments at times are what brings us together. And I think we saw some of that even in these last couple of years with George Floyd now having memorials in Syria and in Gaza, you know, on the walls, speaking to the nature of the solidarity, but also, you know, over these last few months where Gaza was again being assaulted, where communities in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan were facing expulsion, we saw folks show up in solidarity. So I'll wrap up there and just say that I'm honored to be a part of this tradition. I think my experience has brought me, just like many of you all, to this time, and I'm hoping we can continue until we reach our goal of ending systemic racism in the US and in Palestine. Paula, back to you.
Thank you, Ahmad. That was incredible. You know, I know that Dean Wing talks about that it's the conversation, it's the story that moves us, right? And so thank you for sharing so much of your story. We're going to move into question and answer. We have just a very short period of time because both of our speakers have to leave right at the top of the hour. So I'm going to move into questions and answers and start with this one. Many have said this year, we're talking 2021, right? Especially in light of the May 2021 attacks on Gaza and the protests, that we are seeing this conversation about Palestine changing in public opinion polls, in media coverage, in statements from different organizing groups, and even from some congressional representatives. Do you see a role for Black Palestinian Solidarity in this change, and what is that role, and what might be coming up? And Ahmed, I think I'm going to start with you and then ask Dean Wing to come in.
Great. Well, absolutely, we've seen a shift. I mean, for the first time ever in the halls of Congress, we have members of Congress echoing the calls of the grassroots movements leading the work on Palestine. This doesn't happen without decades of work. So, you know, to the folks on this webinar, the UMKR team, to Dean Wing, to all the folks that are out here who've been a part of it, it's really an honor to be able to continue this work. So we're thankful for the work that you all have done to get us here, but we can't stop pushing. You know, we're probably at the point where it's a tipping point now before we reach the opportunity to build mass public support behind Palestinian liberation, and in fact, mass public support behind ending US complicity in our oppression. And that's where I think I'm most excited to be at the helm of an organization like USCPR, is because we're perfectly positioned as folks in the US here to at least reduce the harm by making sure our tax dollars, our weapons, are no longer complicit in the oppression of the Palestinian people. So we have a long ways to go. And I definitely want to hear from Dean Wing again with such a historical experience here. But last thing I'll note on this conversation, because you mentioned Black Palestinian Solidarity in setting this context, is that Ben & Jerry's is a most recent example where, you know, after 10 years of folks organizing to push Ben & Jerry's to pull out of the occupied territories, to pull out of Israel, we finally saw some action. And we have to list the role that the Movement for Black Lives played in recent conversations with Ben & Jerry's, because Ben & Jerry's has been looking to partner with the Movement for Black Lives around the Breathe Act and around social justice here domestically. And Movement for Black Lives was very clear with Ben and Jerry's that they needed to do something about Palestine. And this is just one of the many examples where, you know, Black-Palestinian Solidarity has allowed for us to take the next step in our organizing and in our goals. So I'll stop there so we can hear from Dean Wing.
Yes, I agree with everything Ahmed said. There's so many things going on behind the scenes that you often don't hear about for years. And so when I was in my remarks saying, you know, we have to have coalitions, and that includes people from government, people from corporations. I was thinking Ben and Jerry's, but you know, there's others out there. And what people may not know is there are many people who don't dare to speak out, who are worried about their political careers or their jobs, being taken from them. But when you talk to those people personally, they actually are on the side of Palestinians and yet can't publicly come out until certain things happen. And so as we're having this new phase, the current phase of increased publicity and development, hopefully more of those people, if you feel like, okay, well, this is becoming a more regularized thing to talk about, that momentum will continue. And then you have the generation below Ahmed, the young people in college and high school and others, who look and say, what is this? And demand certain things occur. Because just as, what happened to George Floyd last year, for older people, we've seen many, iterations of that over decades. But for a lot of young people, that was their first big exposure and politicization on that, whether they be Black, Palestinian, white, Asian, Latino, whatever their background. So great question. I'm
going to use the moderator's prerogative here and ask Dean Wing, and following up on what you're talking about, this changing and affecting public opinion, I have noted, and I'm sure in all the things that we read, the influence of young Black, but women of color in terms of leadership, that this guiding leadership. How is the Black feminist tradition, how are we changing the way we protest, changing the way we actually get out on the street, if you will?
Well, in the civil rights movement, it was, of course, very male dominated, and who was allowed to be out front as the leaders. And there was, of course, a lot of sexism in that movement, like every other movement. But you had people like Angela Davis, from the 60s on, who were involved with global issues in Palestine, et cetera. What is fascinating is that Black Lives Matters, everybody may not realize that this comes together from 3 Black lesbians, right? You have to also acknowledge their sexual orientation, which I know can be an issue in certain circles, whether they are in the US or the Middle East or elsewhere. And so seeing young women, Black women, come to the forefront and being allowed to be in the forefront, that there's not a new generation of Black male civil rights leaders who are like pushing these women back or saying, okay, you do the organizing, you get the coffee, and we're going to be out front. And people like Stokely Carmichael in the 60s, who said the position of women in the movement is prone. You could never get away with anything like that today. No matter what group you're from. So I'm excited, and I think you will continue to see more Black women. But part of that people may not know. In my generation, the number of Black women and men in college was equal. And then nationally and internationally, there are more women in college. And in the Black community, because of so many of our men being in prison and out of the educational stream, you have, and Ahmed was mentioning some of the Black universities where it could be 7 or 8 to 1 on how many Black women are in those schools compared to Black men. So part of the dynamic unfortunately, is because so many of our men have been locked up on a scale unknown to the rest of the globe, and therefore not able to be active as they had been able to in those earlier generations of mine. I'm a boomer, and then of course the one before me of Dr. King and others.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I should say, if you're putting questions in the chat, Dean Wing has said, we're going to end right at 1 o'clock, but if you have questions, we will get them to her and she will try to get answers. So don't think that we're going to close this out right at 1 o'clock and you can't get your questions answered. So this question comes up: African Americans and the Palestinian struggle for freedom and equality are connected in many ways. We know that, we've heard about, and the history of solidarity and mutual support is deep. So as we see this incredible shift from grassroots activists, right? The question is, how do we explain the continuing loyalty to Israel that many of our congressional leaders and many of our faith leaders still maintain? And what can we do to help them get in touch with us where we are at the grassroots level? I'm going to leave it, whichever one wants to take that up first.
I think Dean Wing should get us started, and then I can add in anything, Miss.
Well, you know, I've already commented in my remarks. There are many people who don't dare to speak out. And there was actually a book in maybe the 90s from former Congressman Paul Finley on that. They dare to speak out or they don't dare to speak out. And so that's a serious problem. And I don't think it's going to be solved easily. There'll be other forces that will lead to some of these changes.
I'll just add that I think what we recognize is that the pro-Israel lobby is in fact really powerful. However, I think we're starting to see them be defeated in several fights. And so while we acknowledge that there is funding and efforts and workshops and APAC conferences and so on and so forth, even recruitment at historically Black colleges and universities, there's an infrastructure and resources devoted to that. We also see that it's not really as well received or as successful as it used to be. And so, for instance, APAC poured major funding into, and Democratic Majority for Israel, for instance, poured major resources into getting Rashida out of office, into getting Ilhan out of office. You know, Jamal Bowman was able to unseat Elliot Engel. And so, you know, I think what we're recognizing is that the lobby is not as powerful as it used to be. And so we need to continue to obviously drive a wedge between the progressive wing of the party and the mainstream status quoers that are, you know, fully supportive of apartheid and ethnic cleansing as it relates to Palestine. And you know, the more folks that we're able to get elected over the next few years will continue to be to the detriment of the pro-Israel lobby. So I just wanted to add that it is absolutely a factor, and I think, you know, we're weakening that position, and we hope to continue to do so.
Okay, we're almost out of time, because I'm going to give us the last 2 minutes for both of you to talk about, like, call to action, how you want to see us step up, what going forward. But I want to follow up with that point and ask, particularly Dean Wing. We know that accusing Black leaders of being anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel, that's what a lot of what was going on in the 70s and then in the 80s, and we're seeing that coming up again. How best can we fight back and protect ourselves as we speak up for the fight for justice in Palestine?
You know, that's up to each person, because only they can decide what they feel they can do. And today, given social media, how they can organize against you instantaneously, and all these states where you don't even have to have registration for your guns, people have to think what they're willing to do. And also because it affects their families as well. It's not just them, but their families and colleagues. And I think it's up to each of us to consider at what point in our lives we're going to do certain things. So for me, at my stage of life, it's like I have to speak out. I have to move forward. And I think having these private conversations can help for some others who may do that. It won't be everybody, but I have to feel optimistic for my students, my children, my grandchildren, and all of our, descendants, that we can push forward on this issue and hopefully all one day be in Jerusalem. No matter what your background is, that everybody could be in Jerusalem hanging it out, yes, instead of some of us having that privilege and others of us not having that privilege.
Wow. Wow, we're going to take that vision of a free Palestine, an equal Palestine with us. Call to action. I'm going to just jump in. Ahmed, I wanted to ask him to say a little bit more about why it might be important for us to look at supporting and educating and reaching out to the youth in the HBCUs. Because I know that that was one of the things that USCPR is talking about doing. So if you could just say a couple words about that, along with, of course, we want to see support for USCPR.
Great, thank you, Paula. Yeah, so I just mentioned in my last response about how, AIPAC and a lot of these pro-Israel institutions had been recruiting from historically Black colleges and universities for years, establishing programs where they, bring on the student body president and vice president and, the leadership class and indoctrinate them and so that those folks would then become some of the stronger advocates for the state of Israel. And so what we'd like to do is actually, as a movement, finally invest in our own program of education, recruitment, and support and resources for HBCU students. Now, I think the long term, maybe we could see the possibility of SJP chapters being a bit more prominent at HBCUs. But in the short term, at least if we're able to have those conversations with those leaders to make sure that they're aware of the many different dynamics at play here, I think that would be really, really helpful to our cause, because, the Movement for Black Lives moment, the Ferguson moment, the George Floyd moment has taught us that, the Black community continues to push us, to educate us, to call upon us to help fulfill the vision of the America that we were all promised. And we think that solidarity is obviously a treasured part of this fight for justice. I'll just add, as far as action, because I know we're running out of time, visit uscpr.org. And if you could sign up to be on our mailing list, we want to make sure that you're continuing to be involved. HR 2590 is the piece of legislation that we're promoting most dominantly in these moments. And that's because, as Paula referenced, this would make sure that US tax dollars are not being used to lock up Palestinian children, to demolish Palestinian homes, et cetera, et cetera. So sign up for support at uscpr.org, visit all of our social media platforms, US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and support, and make sure your member of Congress is supporting HR 2590. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you. Dean, we know you have to be off right at the hour. Thank you so much, Ahmed. Always good to see you. And so we're going to say goodbye to our speakers because they need to be off. We have a little bit more time. Bridget's going to come in and talk about what's next for MFSA and UMKR. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on our really, really engaging conversation today. Be on the lookout for the recording for this call and details for our next webinar. Our next webinar together will be in November. All of this information will be emailed to you by both MFSA and UMKR. As you signed up for this webinar, we have that information, so you'll be able to be contacted by both of us. And you can also find this webinar along with our past webinars on both of our YouTube channels. So just you can type our names into YouTube and you can find us and you can find that information. This webinar will be probably posted either by the end of this week or beginning of next week. You are also invited to another webinar that we're both co-hosting along with the Native American International Caucus on the doctrine of discovery. You can join us for our second session of that series. It's on October 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern, where we'll be talking more about, more in depth about this question, who owns the land? I'm going to drop the registration in the chat so you can check that out. But we will be really kind of doing a deep dive about land ownership, not only here in the Americas, particularly North America, but we'll also be talking about Palestine as well. And I think you all will be very interested in that conversation. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you will join us on our next call.